Okay, looks like I'm recording. This is chapter 9 about informative speaking. And I'm going to share my screen here so you can see my PowerPoint slideshow. And hopefully this will work and we're up and running. All right. So once again, thinking about the difference between informative and persuasive. So informative is about teaching you something. How do you go from not knowing something to knowing something, to becoming more aware? Here's an example here of some folks who are doing Islamophobia Awareness Day. That intent is informative. They just want people to understand more about Islam and what it is to be a Muslim in order to reduce anti-Muslim sentiment. Is that persuasive? A little, I guess, trying to persuade people not to be jerks, but mainly the idea is that by just sharing information, they're going to diminish Islamophobia. Another kind of a thing we do with an informative speech is how to do or make something. This is an example here. This is a strawberry rhubarb pie. How do I know? Because I made this pie. I could do an informative speech where I teach you how to make a strawberry rhubarb pie. This pie is, if you know things about pies, this was moderately successful. These lattice crust should have gone all the way. There's too much filling. It rose up over. I know it, disastrous. Persuasion is trying to change people from the way they are to the way you'd like them to be. Selling products, getting people to do something. So here's an example of a persuasive appeal that is simply visual about saving paper. But there's also sort of embedded in here is save the whales, save the trees, save the world, I guess by listening to audiobooks. But pretty clear, the challenges for all of you in these first speeches is to try to stay on the informative side. Yes, you could try to persuade, but how about just having the conversation and increasing somebody else's awareness without necessarily trying to change them from the way they are to the way you'd like them to be? So the difference there is simply intention. What do you as the speaker intend? And that's internal. And so you're going to have to be a person of integrity and be honest with your own intentions here, holding back the persuasion that you might want to be doing. So the book talks about some things about demonstration speeches. I think it's worth noting because even though we're not doing them in this class, there's a reasonable chance you're going to do them in the future. So some things that the book offers here, I'll go through these very quickly. Just note, demonstrations always take longer than you expect. You have to practice. And you have to practice with your props, with whatever you're demonstrating in order to make sure that you really do have an understanding of how long it's going to take to do anything. When you watch cooking shows, you'll notice that oftentimes they will fast forward through some things, right? And I pop the crust in the oven and, oh, well, here's a finished crust that I put in 35 minutes ago, right? Because the timing of cooking stuff takes so long. Or if you're watching cooking videos, oftentimes there'll be a section where they're speeding it up, and just to get through it, because it's like, we don't need to sit here with you for 15 minutes while you reduce that sauce. Making sure audience can see everything. And in this world of Zoom and cameras, in your generation, I think is really going to be adept at this. Just how do you see things? How do you manipulate things, especially very small things for a large audience? You're going to use a camera. Okay, page 226, there's an example speech in your book. I want you to make sure you look at this speech and go back and review it with some of these notes, please. That I think there's some things in that speech that are good, and there's some things in that speech that are lousy. And so I don't want you to just look at that speech and go, this is exactly how I'm supposed to do things. It's not. So generally, the structure is solid, intro, body, conclusion. A couple other things that are just popping up here right away, right? The rule of three, you'll notice that there are 3 main points in that body. The oral citations are strong here. Look at this, according to the National Meningitis Association, they're telling you where they got the information about meningitis. and not overtelling, right? I don't need to know every detail of the website and things like that, but just saying, hey, this is from the National Meningitis Association. The assumption is that that's credible. So the oral citations are strong and they're using good, strong, credible sources. Transitions are clean, helping us know where we are. And looking at the outline itself, the structure of how they do the outline, this is a good example of a multi-level outline. I'm asking you to create a multi-level outline of your speech and share that with me. It allows me to see what you're thinking, how you're thinking about the parts. Because once again, once you're actually in the speech, it can get muddy to figure out just by listening to you when you're transitioning from one idea to the next. It shouldn't be muddy, but it can be. And so if I can see what you're doing in the structure of your speech on paper and be listening to you doing the speech, watching you do that recording of the speech, I'll go, that's what they were thinking, right? And then we can work on how to fix any problems that appear. So some strong things about that speech. Here are some problems with that speech. First of all, the grabber. That first thing out of your mouth is important. And starting with a rhetorical survey is a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea in a live public speaking situation. This notion of how many of you heard about this thing? And then it's like, are you doing a poll? Are you going to have people raise their hands or applaud? Are you going to analyze that data immediately and turn it around? Because the people in the front row who raise their hands can't see how many people have raised their hands. Only you, the speaker, can, right? So it's really a selfish way to open your speech. And it's even worse when part of your audience is online. That, what are they going to do? Go to an online poll? It's ridiculous. So find a stronger grabber. That they have the story of a friend that they embed in the speech. Much better to start with that. Maybe a startling statistic. Anyway, lots of ways to start your speech. Starting it with, hey, how many of you have heard of this thing? What do you know about this? Is an invitation to dialogue, but you're making a speech. So don't invite dialogue in your grabber. Lots of rhetorical questions, starting with that initial rhetorical question. If you just take that rhetorical question, transform it into a statement, then you have something strong. See, what happens is that in a speech, you'll ask the rhetorical question and then answer it. Just start with the answer rather than playing the game of pretending to ask a question that you're not really doing. Now, for me, I will often do rhetorical questions in a draft that I'm doing as I'm writing these things. I'm like, well, what is this thing? And it's part of my own process, but I move beyond it, right? Try to remove rhetorical questions, in part because in a public speaking situation, people don't know if they're really supposed to answer. And sometimes it's taken as an invitation to heckle. You've asked the question to the audience. Maybe somebody smartass out there is going to give an answer, throw you off, right? Just better to stay away from rhetorical questions. Organization, right? I'm going to harp at you about organization. We've already done that in an earlier chapter here, right? About the topical organization. So in this case, their first main point is, what is bacterial meningitis? No. As I've said, don't use a definition as a main point. If you have to define, that goes in the introduction, not as a main body point. The other main body points are, how do we get bacterial meningitis? A rhetorical question. And what happens when we get bacterial meningitis? Another rhetorical question. Better to reframe those. Yes, you start with the questions as you're drafting, but then you change it to what the answers are. So, Dr. Winterstein, what would you do rather than a topical organization? Well, here's an example, right? Chronological pattern makes perfect sense to me in terms of bacterial meningitis. And even the way that they framed it in some ways is leaning into the chronological. So how do you catch it? How does the disease advance? And then how do you get treatment and recovery? Hopefully you can quickly see how that is a chronological pattern and you're taking us through the progress of the disease. We understand it. We always know where we are in the organizational pattern as the speech is going on. Finally, note that these are not speaking notes. This is basically a full sentence outline. You could take and transform this very quickly into an essay. In order to transform it into a speech, you have to remove almost all the words. And then you will have speaking notes that you'll go from. So this is a transcription of a speech. These are not the speaking notes for a speech. These are really, in many ways, the notes that you would use either for the speech or for an essay. Just note that you have to take that next step, because if you write this full sentence outline and then take it up to the podium with you to speak, you will turn into a reading mode, and that's a C. Anybody can read. You got to take that step into extemporaneous speaking. So some good things about this sample speech, some really problematic things about this sample speech. Okay, so the chapter talks about how do you help your audience remember the things, how do you make stuff sticky in your head. So in an informative speech. So there are times when you do need to define words and concepts. That's important, helps people follow along. If they don't understand what the words mean, then you're going to lose them. So when are you going to do it? When it's necessary. As I've noted, you got to do your audience analysis, right? Don't define prostitution for us. Okay, so some fancy words here: etymology, synonym, antonym, or essential features. So I had a friend I was just talking with yesterday about my wife's rib fractures and the pneumothorax that she had. And he said, what's a pneumothorax, right? So I was using the fancy medical term pneumothorax, and he didn't know it. Completely logical, reasonable thing. Very bright guy, right? It's nothing like shameful about not knowing what something is, right? So he wanted me to explain what that definition is. Well, let me tell you, the etymology of pneumothorax, where does that word come from? What is the Latin behind it? Well, pneumothorax, pneumo meaning air, right? Same place we get the word pneumatic from for pneumatic tools. Those are air-driven tools. And thorax, of course, is your chest. So it means pneumothorax is air in the chest. Well, what is the problem with air in the chest? Well, the problem is that you have a lung and you have the lining of the lung and then you have your ribs. And if air gets in between those layers, it pushes on the lung. And then you have less lung capacity, eventually perhaps leading to a collapsed lung. There you go. Okay, so pneumothorax, air in the lung. So I gave him the etymology very quickly. And then, a synonym, what's it like? Well, I kind of just said it's like air in there. Maybe it's like having a tire that's inflating inside your chest wall, pressing on that, right? I could give a metaphor like that. Synonyms, what is it similar to? Antonym, what's it opposite of? It's the opposite of, say, a tumor. A tumor is a solid mass. A person who has a lung tumor has the same problem, but it's a solid mass. So you might say that a pneumothorax is the opposite of a tumor. It's because it's air and a little bit of fluid, you can actually drain it. Astonishing. So anyway, as I'm talking about pneumothorax with you, I'm using etymology, synonym, antonym, and essential features to explain what a pneumothorax is. So if I was doing an informative speech about, my wife's lung problems, that would be something I would need to do, is define pneumothorax, because a few of you might have known what it is, but I think most don't. That's what my audience analysis says. So there's an example of when you would define. How are you going to know? Well, you're going to know by using your brain, talking to your classmates, talking to your roommates and some other folks as you're going along here. Do they know what this thing is or not as you're working on your speech? If you have any questions or doubts, you can do it. Are you going to make mistakes? All of us do, right? How do you try to get through it? Making your best hypothesis about your audience and what they know. It helps to have descriptions. When you're describing things, vivid, concrete, brief. When you're describing, so if I was to describe what the lung stent was, what's that called? It's escaping me for the moment here. Chest tube. Carrie had a chest tube put in, right? What is that like? Well, it's like a little straw that they insert between the ribs into that lining between the chest wall and the lung in order to pull that air and fluid out, right? Vivid, concrete, brief. It's actually hooked up to a little vacuum tube. There's negative pressure on it in order to help keep pulling the air out and drawing the lung closer to the wall so it all stitches back up again. Thank God for modern medicine, people. Explanations. So you got to, when you're going to explain something, it's going to be answering one of these questions: how, what, why. That's where those rhetorical questions might come in. If you are asking that question in your own notes or as you're working along, great. Just jump right into the answer. Stories are really powerful in understanding and memorizing, remembering things, right? That I could be talking about collapsed lungs, but if I tell you the story of my wife falling on the side of her ski, cracking ribs and all that stuff, it's going to stick in your head better. Somehow there's that connection of a person's story. It would connect even better if you knew Carrie. If I was actually doing this, I would show pictures of her, what does she look like on the ski hill, maybe a little video. Anyway, who knows? But that stuff will help you remember. Okay, so this notion of stickiness, right? How do we make stuff stick? The idea of an informative speech is to take information that you have in your head now because you've become the resident expert and you are moving that into other people's heads. How do you make that stuff stick? So first words are, important, that punchy grabber. What's that first thing out of your mouth? Can you make us pay more attention? If you can do that with your first words, then we're more likely to be paying attention the whole way. If you don't do that with your first words, we're going to start to drift. It's just the way we are. Really think about what are the first things out of your mouth when you get up to speak. I'm going to say to you, you ready? You go, yeah. And I'll say, go ahead, whenever you're ready. And there will be a second or two or three of pause while the video is up and running and we're all just sort of, okay, here we go. What are those first words that you're going to choose? If your first words are, today I'm going to tell you about a pneumothorax, it's not very evocative. If I started with, my wife nearly died and had to be evacuated by a helicopter. Okay, we're paying attention, right? Nearly dying, evacuated by helicopter. Those things tell us where we are in that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That evocative first words, if you can get us into the bottom of that triangle, of that pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's more likely. So really think about what is that punchy thing that you've got, that you've created. Maybe there's a great startling statistic. Maybe there's a quote that you want to use. Any of those things really grab our attention right away. It will help the rest of the speech stick in our brains. Acronyms and mnemonics. So in this case, this is an example of the different orders of ages of geologic time. You'll notice the bottoms of these, like Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, right? Because they have got the interesting dinosaurs in them. But these are the different periods of the evolution of the planet. And so how do you memorize these things? In this case, it's a phrase like camels often sit down carefully, perhaps their joints creak. Right? Those first letters are connecting across. Every good boy does fine is a way of remembering the notes or the lines on the staff in music. There was one about the planets, many very early mice. I can't remember the rest of it because I just memorized the planets, right? Mercury, Venus, Saturn, all these. I really can't do them. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, right? I don't need the mnemonic for that, but other times it's really useful. There might be a mnemonic you're using. Okay, here's the main things. It's when it's, you may know some of these from EMT stuff, if you learn about like chest compressions and things like that. Anyway, there's a bunch of them out there. If you're doing something, it might be useful for stickiness. Repetition. Tell us what you're telling us. That does help people to remember it, as if they get told more than once. Emotional connections. If you can connect the audience emotionally to your topic, it's going to be stickier. So if you've got something and you can use pictures of puppies and kittens and we're like, oh, we are more likely. You'll see this in all kinds of persuasive appeals, particularly fundraising appeals, right? They'll show pictures of starving children, pictures of animals in need. All these things create these emotional connections with the audience. It's more likely for us then to be activated by that. Shared experiences. So this was the beanie toss from a couple years ago. You guys didn't get that shared connection of the beanie toss on Olin Hill because we were virtual this fall. I left this in here. There are shared experiences that you are having. Some of this Zoom stuff is going to be shared experience, for example, that others haven't had in the same way. Not all shared experiences are glorious, but that is a way of connecting to your audience and having stuff stick. It's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. I've done that. Call to action is a way of stickiness, right? Getting people to say, here, do this thing. Then they are more likely to remember it if they can picture themselves doing it. Personally, I can never picture myself bungee jumping. It seems insane to me. Okay, some steps. Going over this again, right? As I said, the book has got a lot of repetition in it, so you're going to see this again here. So what are your steps for making this informative speech? First of all, what's your topic? What's your purpose? Thinking about the research outline. So think as you're beginning to get started on your research, giving yourself an outline. I think these are my main topics. I think this is a way of breaking this information into chunks and so that audiences can digest it. And then you go out and you do your research. You take that research outline, you go do your research, then you come back and you're like, okay, I found some things. Some of this worked, some of it didn't, and you massage it, right? You're not stuck with your research outline, but it does help to have a preliminary outline of, I think I might be going in this direction. Then you're going to do your research, finding good information. You're going to then organize, make main points and all that stuff, finding a coherent organizational pattern. You're going to plan your intro and conclusion after you've done your main body. There's no sense in doing the intro and conclusion before. Then you need to take that outline. You can have all these notes in this big, massive, long outline. You could take that outline and make it into an essay. In this case, you are going to reduce it down into speaking notes. Practicing out loud. I really recommend you get into the room. Once you're at the point of practicing it, go into our classroom and practice it out loud in the classroom in order to be confident and comfortable. Okay, that is it for this lecture on Chapter 9, Informative Speaking. Bye.